November, 1943. Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. Lieutenant Koji Tanaka stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching American aircraft circle overhead like vultures. Around him, the harbor was filled with the wreckage of Japanese vessels, some still burning from the morning's raid, others half submerged with their masts pointing accusingly at the sky. This was the third major raid in 2 weeks. Each time, more ships were lost. Each time, replacements became harder to find. Each time, the question grew more urgent. How could the Americans replace their losses so quickly, while Japan struggled to rebuild even a fraction of what was destroyed? Tanaka had been fighting since Pearl Harbor. He had seen the initial victories, the rapid conquests, the string of successes that seemed to validate everything Japan had been promised. But now, nearly 2 years into the conflict, something had changed. The Americans weren't just resisting. They were advancing. And they were doing it with a seemingly endless supply of ships, aircraft, and equipment. What Tanaka didn't know was that they were facing an industrial capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. American shipyards were producing vessels at a rate that seemed physically impossible. What took Japan 6 months to build, America built in 6 weeks. This is the story of how American industrial might transform the Pacific conflict. How shipyard workers in California, Oregon, and the East Coast became as important as any soldier on the front lines. And how Japanese military planners slowly realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation about America's ability to wage industrial operations. The statistics were staggering, almost unbelievable. In 1943 alone, American shipyards would launch over 2,700 ships of all types. This included fleet carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and thousands of support vessels. The Liberty Ship program, designed to mass-produce cargo vessels, was completing ships at a rate of 3 per day at its peak. 3 ships per day. The number seemed impossible, yet it was real, verified, and terrifying for anyone who understood its implications. The foundation of this industrial miracle had been laid years before Pearl Harbor. American industrial capacity in the 1930s was already the largest in the world, though much of it lay dormant during economic difficulties. When mobilization began in 1940, that sleeping giant began to wake. President Franklin Roosevelt had called for America to become the arsenal of democracy. He set production targets that many considered fantasy. In May 1940, he called for production of 50,000 aircraft per year. Military planners said it was impossible. By 1944, America was producing over 96,000 aircraft per year. The impossible had become routine. The shipbuilding program followed a similar trajectory. In 1939, American shipyards built fewer than 100 ocean-going vessels. By 1943, they were building over 2,700. This wasn't gradual expansion. This was transformation on a scale that redefined what industrial production meant. The methods were revolutionary. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft, with each vessel individually constructed by skilled workers over months or years. American shipyards, led by innovators like Henry Kaiser, transformed shipbuilding into mass production. Kaiser had never built a ship before entering the maritime industry. He was a construction engineer who had worked on dams and bridges. But he understood mass production, assembly line techniques, and modular construction. He applied these principles to shipbuilding with revolutionary results. The Liberty ship, the EC-2S-C1 type cargo vessel, became the symbol of American production capacity. These ships were 441 feet long, displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded, and could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. They were designed to be simple, reliable, and above all, fast to build. Traditional shipbuilding constructed vessels from the keel up, with each component added sequentially. Kaiser's yards built ships in prefabricated sections. Hull sections, deck sections, engine rooms. All were assembled separately by different teams, then welded together. This parallel construction dramatically reduced building time. The first Liberty ships took about 230 days to build. Within a year, Kaiser's yards had reduced this to 40 days. By 1943, the average was 30 days. The record, set by the Robert E. Peary in November 1942, was an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, 30 minutes from keel laying to launch. 4 days to build a 14,000-ton cargo ship. Japanese military intelligence officers who received this information dismissed it as propaganda. No one could build ships that fast. It had to be American exaggeration. But it wasn't propaganda. It was real. And it represented just one aspect of American industrial capacity. The Essex-class fleet carriers, the backbone of the American carrier force, normally took about 2 years to build using traditional methods. By 1943, with refined techniques and expanded facilities, the building time had been reduced to under 16 months. The shipyards were launching a new Essex-class carrier every 2 months. Every 2 months, a new fleet carrier joined the Pacific Fleet. Each carrier could operate 8,100 aircraft. Each represented striking power equivalent to multiple battleships, and they kept coming one after another in a procession that seemed endless. Japanese naval planners studied these numbers with growing desperation. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, already strained, could not match even a fraction of American production. The Shokaku-class carriers, Japan's newest and best, had taken over 2 years to build. Japan would complete only 2 of these carriers during the entire conflict. America would complete 24 Essex-class carriers by the conflict's end, plus dozens of smaller escort carriers, plus battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines in quantities Japan could not match. The escort carrier program demonstrated the scale of American production even more dramatically. These were smaller carriers built on merchant ship hulls, designed to provide air cover for convoys and support amphibious operations. They were less capable than fleet carriers, but far faster to build. Kaiser's Vancouver yard began producing escort carriers in 1942. Using the same mass production techniques developed for Liberty ships, the yard eventually reduced construction time to under 3 months per carrier. By the conflict's end, America would have built 122 escort carriers. Japan would build 5 light carriers in the same period. The destroyer program showed similar disparities. American shipyards produced 349 Fletcher-class destroyers between 1942 and 1945. These were modern, capable vessels with radar, sonar, and heavy anti-aircraft armament. Japan would complete 32 destroyers of comparable capability in the same period. The submarine program was equally one-sided. American shipyards built 203 fleet submarines during the conflict. These vessels would devastate Japanese merchant shipping. Japan built 126 submarines in the same period, but raw numbers told only part of the story. The quality of American production was as important as the quantity. Ships built quickly could have been crude and unreliable. Instead, American vessels were generally well-built, reliable, and incorporated the latest technology. Radar, which had been experimental in 1940, was standard equipment on American vessels by 1943. Combat information centers gave American ships decisive advantages in night combat. Damage control systems made American ships remarkably survivable. Japanese intelligence struggled to explain this production capacity to military leadership. The numbers seemed impossible. Surely the Americans were counting damaged ships returned to service as new construction. Surely something was wrong with the intelligence, but the intelligence was accurate. The numbers were real, and they represented a level of industrial capacity that Japan simply could not match. Behind the statistics and production numbers were millions of American workers who transformed industrial capacity into reality. The shipyards of 1943 bore little resemblance to the facilities of 1939. They had expanded from specialized craftwork shops into massive industrial complexes, employing tens of thousands of workers. Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California employed over 90,000 workers at its peak. The facility operated 3 shifts, 7 days a week, with work continuing around the clock. The yard had 4 shipways, each capable of building multiple Liberty ships simultaneously. The workforce itself had changed dramatically. Before the conflict, shipbuilding was a male-dominated trade requiring years of apprenticeship. By 1943, women comprised over 25% of shipyard workers. The famous Rosie the Riveter was not a single person but thousands of women, welders, riveters, electricians, and fitters who mastered skills that had been closed to them before. African Americans, previously excluded from most skilled industrial jobs by discrimination, found employment in shipyards and proved themselves as capable as any workers. The labor shortage forced industries to abandon discriminatory practices that had wasted human potential. The training programs were revolutionary. Traditional apprenticeships lasting years were replaced by intensive courses lasting weeks. Welding schools taught women who had never held tools to make strong, reliable welds. The quality control was rigorous. The standards were high, but the training was fast and effective. Margaret Lowe had been a schoolteacher in Oregon before the conflict. In 1942, she enrolled in a shipyard welding course. After 6 weeks of training, she went to work at the Portland Kaiser yard. Within a year, she was a lead welder supervising a team of 12 workers. "We knew what we were building," she said in a later interview. "Every ship we built would carry supplies, carry troops, bring boys home. We worked hard because it mattered. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. It was exhausting. But we knew soldiers and sailors were working harder in more dangerous places." The shipyards developed social support systems that helped maintain the workforce. Company-operated child care centers allowed women with children to work. Cafeterias provided meals around the clock. Medical clinics treated injuries. Housing assistance helped workers find accommodation near the yards. The speed of construction required innovations in technique and organization. Traditional riveting was replaced by welding, which was faster and created stronger joins. Prefabrication of major sections allowed parallel construction. Assembly line techniques, borrowed from automotive production, transformed shipbuilding from craft to industry. The logistics of coordinating this industrial effort were staggering. Rail networks strained to deliver steel, equipment, and components to shipyards. Suppliers had to expand their own production. Skilled workers had to be recruited, trained, and retained. Richmond, California, grew from a city of 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943, driven almost entirely by shipyard employment. Portland, Oregon, saw similar explosive growth. The social transformation was profound. Communities that had been racially segregated found black and white workers laboring side by side. Women who had been expected to remain in domestic roles found themselves earning substantial wages and mastering industrial skills. Japanese soldiers capturing American prisoners in the Pacific would interrogate them about conditions at home, expecting to hear about shortages, suffering, and declining morale. Instead, they heard about full employment, rising wages, and factories working at capacity. The interrogators often didn't believe what they heard, but the opposite was true. American industrial production reached its peak in 1943 to 1944, precisely when the fighting was most intense. The economy was growing, not contracting. Employment was full, not scarce. Production was accelerating, not declining. This was the fundamental miscalculation Japanese strategic planners had made before Pearl Harbor. They had assumed that America, though industrially strong, lacked the will to sustain a long conflict. They had assumed that initial defeats would demoralize Americans and lead to negotiated peace. Every assumption was wrong. Pearl Harbor had unified American opinion more completely than any political speech could have. The industrial capacity that had seemed theoretical in 1940 became real by 1942. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in America and understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese leaders, had warned before Pearl Harbor. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve." By 1943, that prediction had proven accurate. The sleeping giant was fully awake, and the results were visible in harbors across the Pacific. By mid-1943, the impact of American industrial production was becoming impossible for Japanese forces to ignore. Every major engagement revealed American advantages in numbers, equipment quality, and replacement capacity. Lieutenant Koji Tanaka, standing in Rabaul Harbor watching the destruction around him, represented thousands of Japanese soldiers who were beginning to understand the arithmetic of their situation. Japan started the conflict with numerical superiority in most categories, but attrition was working against them in ways that couldn't be overcome. A Japanese destroyer sunk in battle might be replaced in 6 months, if at all. An American destroyer sunk in the same battle would be replaced in 6 weeks, and probably by 2 destroyers, not 1. A Japanese aircraft carrier lost was effectively irreplaceable. An American carrier lost would be replaced within months by a better, larger carrier. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers. These represented the core of Japanese naval aviation. The loss was catastrophic and irreplaceable. America lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, at Midway. By November 1943, America had commissioned 7 new Essex-class carriers, each superior to the carriers Japan lost. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Japan was fighting an attrition campaign against an opponent who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The merchant shipping situation illustrated the disparity most clearly. Japan's economy depended absolutely on maritime trade. The home islands lacked essential raw materials, food, and fuel. Everything had to be imported from conquered territories. This required a large merchant fleet operating continuously. American submarines were systematically destroying Japanese merchant vessels. In 1943, American submarines sank over 300 Japanese merchant ships totaling 1.5 million tons. Japan's shipbuilding capacity could replace perhaps 1/3 of these losses. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. Japanese merchant tonnage was declining steadily. By late 1944, Japan would face critical shortages because the merchant fleet could no longer maintain supply lines. Meanwhile, American merchant shipping was expanding explosively. The Liberty Ship program alone was adding cargo capacity faster than submarines could possibly sink it. This meant American forces could be supplied lavishly while Japanese forces grew progressively weaker from supply shortages. An American soldier in the Pacific received regular resupply. A Japanese soldier on a bypassed island might receive no resupply for months. The industrial advantage cascaded into tactical advantages. American forces could afford to use ammunition liberally because resupply was reliable. Japanese forces had to conserve ammunition because resupply was uncertain. American forces could evacuate wounded for proper medical treatment. Japanese wounded often remained in primitive field hospitals with inadequate supplies. American air superiority, which became increasingly dominant through 1943 and 1944, was fundamentally based on production capacity. Japanese aircraft losses could not be replaced quickly enough. Meanwhile, American aircraft production and pilot training programs expanded continuously. By 1944, the ratio of American to Japanese aircraft production exceeded 10-1. American aircraft were generally equal or superior in quality. American pilots received longer, more thorough training. The result was predictable. Japanese air forces, which had achieved dominance in 1941-1942, were systematically destroyed by 1944. Not through superior tactics alone, but through overwhelming numbers backed by industrial capacity. The island-hopping campaign demonstrated how American production translated into operational capability. Each amphibious assault required massive naval support, carriers to provide air cover, battleships and cruisers for bombardment, destroyers for screening, transports for troops, landing craft for the assault itself. The invasion of Tarawa in November 1943 involved over 200 ships. The invasion of Saipan in June 1944 involved over 500 ships. The invasion of Okinawa in April 1945 involved over 1,500 ships. Each of these fleets represented more tonnage than the entire Japanese Navy could muster. And after each operation, damaged American ships returned to Pearl Harbor or West Coast yards for repair, which was completed quickly by the same industrial system that built the ships. Japanese ships damaged in the same operations often remained in forward bases, with minimal repair facilities. Japanese naval strategy by 1944 had become desperate. Unable to match American forces in conventional combat, Japanese planners developed concepts like Operation Ago, which sought to use land-based aircraft from island bases to supplement carrier forces. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 tested this strategy. Japanese forces assembled every available carrier and hundreds of land-based aircraft. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which American naval aviators destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, while losing fewer than 100 American aircraft. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. The lopsided victory wasn't primarily due to superior American courage or tactics, though these factors mattered. It was due to superior aircraft, better trained pilots, and numerical advantage, all products of American industrial capacity. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. The carriers remained afloat, but had few trained pilots and inadequate aircraft. American forces continued advancing, supplied by the endless stream of ships from American yards. Each operation consumed material in staggering quantities, but the supplies kept coming, delivered by Liberty ships that were being built faster than they could be sunk. Japanese soldiers, watching this material abundance, struggled to reconcile it with what they had been told about American weakness. The propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, comfort-loving people who would collapse under hardship. The reality was an opponent who could sustain losses that would cripple Japan while continuously escalating their own operations. By 1945, the industrial disparity between America and Japan had reached almost absurd proportions. American shipyards were building more tonnage per month than the entire Japanese Navy had available. American aircraft production exceeded Japanese production by factors of 15 or 20-1. The statistics from 1944 tell the story starkly. American shipyards built 2,247 ships of all types. Japan built 248. American factories produced 96 318 aircraft. Japan produced 28,180. American industry produced 17,565 tanks. Japan produced 401. In every category, the disparity was enormous and growing. Japanese soldiers who had fought since 1941 could trace the progression in their own experiences. In 1941-1942, supplies had been adequate, equipment functioned properly, and replacement equipment arrived regularly. By 1943, supplies were tighter. By 1945, many units received no resupply at all. Meanwhile, American units were so well supplied that logistics officers worried more about managing abundance than coping with shortage. The human cost of industrial disparity was immense. Japanese soldiers fought with increasing desperation as their situation became hopeless. Isolated garrisons, cut off by American advances and receiving no resupply, held out with dwindling resources. Lieutenant Koji Tanaka survived Rabaul and was eventually evacuated to the home islands. He witnessed the final collapse of Japanese military power, watching American aircraft overhead in numbers that seemed impossible. Where did they all come from? How could one nation produce so many aircraft, so many ships, so much material? In post-conflict interviews, Japanese military leaders consistently identified industrial capacity as the decisive factor. Admiral Minechi Koga stated, "The Americans could replace their losses within weeks. We could not replace ours at all. We fought the Americans with courage and skill, but we could not match their production." The shipyard workers in Richmond, Portland, and dozens of other American cities never faced combat, but their contribution was as essential to victory as any soldiers. Every Liberty ship they built carried supplies to the front. Every destroyer they launched protected convoys. Every carrier they completed brought air power to the Pacific. Margaret Lowe, the former teacher who became a welder, reflected on her experience. "We didn't think about ourselves as part of something historic. We were just doing a job that needed doing. But after the conflict ended and we learned about shortages the Japanese faced, we understood that what we built in the shipyards had mattered as much as anything done in combat." The transformation of American industry from 1940 to 1945 represented mobilization on a scale never before achieved. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. Over 300,000 aircraft produced, 88,000 tanks built, 2.4 million trucks manufactured, 6,500 naval vessels constructed, 5,400 cargo ships completed. The impact extended beyond military victory. The industrial infrastructure built for production became peacetime capacity. The workers trained had skills applicable to civilian industry. The organizational techniques influenced American industry for decades. The lessons were studied by military planners worldwide. Industrial capacity was recognized as fundamental to modern military power, potentially more important than tactical brilliance or strategic doctrine. The Japanese strategic error at Pearl Harbor was not attacking American forces. It was underestimating American industrial capacity and will to mobilize that capacity. Japanese planners assumed that destroying the Pacific Fleet would give Japan time to establish a defensive perimeter. This assumption failed to account for American ability to replace the Pacific Fleet many times over. By November 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, American shipyards had already replaced the tonnage lost in that attack. By December 1943, American naval forces in the Pacific exceeded the entire Japanese Navy in total tonnage. By 1945, the disparity was so enormous that comparisons became meaningless. The Liberty ship program completed 2,610 vessels between 1941 and 1945. These ships, built by workers who had never worked in shipyards before, carried 75% of all military cargo transported during the conflict. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who transformed shipbuilding, became a symbol of American industrial might. He had never built a ship before the conflict. Yet his innovations made him one of the most successful shipbuilders in history. His success demonstrated that American industrial flexibility could solve seemingly impossible challenges. The contrast with Japanese industry was stark. Japanese shipyards continued using traditional construction methods throughout the conflict. Labor shortages, resource scarcity, and strategic bombing disrupted production increasingly. By mid-1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size. The nation faced starvation, with food imports insufficient to feed the population. Industry slowed dramatically due to lack of raw materials. The atomic strikes in August 1945 ended the conflict before maritime strangulation could force surrender through starvation. But Japanese planners understood that surrender was inevitable regardless. The industrial arithmetic had become impossible. In the decades after the conflict, historians and economists studied the production statistics with professional admiration. The achievement represented by American industrial mobilization remains unmatched. No nation before or since has mobilized industrial capacity so completely and effectively in such a short time. The shipyard workers, factory workers, and millions of civilians who supported production understood their contribution. They had transformed American industrial potential into military reality. They had built the material foundation for victory while soldiers and sailors fought with the equipment they produced. Japanese soldiers who survived the conflict often spoke of the hopelessness they felt when they finally understood the scale of American production. They had fought with courage against overwhelming material superiority. No amount of courage could overcome such disparity. The arithmetic of power was brutally simple. America could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. America could expand production continuously while Japanese production declined. This was the conflict Japan had hoped to avoid by achieving rapid early victories and forcing negotiated settlement. Instead, they found themselves in exactly the prolonged industrial conflict their strategic planning had identified as unwinnable. The shipyards of Richmond, the factories of Detroit, the training camps across America all represented a form of military power that Japanese strategic planners had underestimated. By the time they understood their error, it was far too late. Japanese soldiers couldn't believe how many ships America could build in 1 month because the numbers seemed physically impossible. 3 Liberty ships per day, a new Essex-class carrier every 2 months. Destroyers completed faster than they could be sunk. The numbers were real and represented industrial capacity that determined the conflict's outcome as surely as any battle. In the end, the conflict in the Pacific was won in shipyards in California and Oregon as much as on beaches across the Pacific. The workers who welded hulls, riveted decks, and fitted equipment never received the recognition given to combat veterans. But their contribution was essential, decisive, and historically significant. The lesson resonates today. Military power in modern conflict depends on industrial capacity, economic strength, and ability to mobilize resources effectively. Technology and tactics matter, but sustained operations require industrial foundation. The nation that can produce, supply, and sustain forces will prevail over the nation that cannot, regardless of initial advantages. American industrial mobilization demonstrated what a democratic society could achieve when unified toward common purpose. The transformation from economic difficulty to unprecedented production proved that free societies, properly motivated, could outproduce systems that claimed efficiency advantages. The ships built in those years carried American power across the Pacific. They represented victory achieved through steel, welding, and determination as much as through combat, and they remain symbols of what industrial democracy can accomplish when challenged.